Okay, good evening, everybody. I'd like to call to order the special meeting of the Common Council for February 9th, 2021. As tradition, would you please join me in the Pledge of Allegiance to our flag? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. Clerk, would you please call the roll?
Mr. Burnett,
Present.
Ms. Johnson,
Present.
Mr. Langella, Mr. Sacchinelli,
Present.
Ms. Smith,
Here.
Mr. Huvelman,
Present.
Mr. Roberts, Ms. Ravulis,
Here.
Ms. Young,
Here.
Mr. Kites,
Here.
Mr. Theodorides, Mr. Keegan, Mr. Sirenides, Mr. Livingston,
Here.
Ms. Shanahan.
Here.
11 present, Mayor. You have a quorum.
Thank you very much. And we'll move into the first item on the agenda and the only item on the agenda, the presentation of the 21-22 City of Norwalk operating budget. Mr. Dakowitz.
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you, council members. Appreciate the opportunity to present this to you. As I mentioned last night, Angela Fogel, the budget director, last week had a medical emergency and she's out of commission for several weeks. So we were 95% of the way through with the budget. We've been able to conclude this presentation. The budget books will be shortly delayed. We all hope for her quick and 100% recovery. Let me share my screen. Can everyone see that? No?
No.
Okay, here we go. Share screen. How about now? Can you see that now?
Yes, we can.
Great, thank you. So let me start with some background. Here's what I will cover this evening. I'll start with the budget process. I will talk about some laws of economics that apply to budgeting. I will present the recommended operating budget, discuss a little bit of the Board of Education and the efficiency study. I'll then go into some detail looking at the recommended operating budget by city department, talk about the unrestricted unassigned fund balance, often called the rainy day fund, and wrap it up by talking about how the budget translates into the tax levy and the mill rate. So the process is lengthy. The budget director sends pro forma budgets to each department October 5th. We look at the past 3 years' budget and actual numbers. We make calculations about what we think is appropriate for next year's budget for each department. The departments look at those numbers and come back to us with a requested budget. And then the budget director and I meet with each and every department to discuss their requests, the differences from the pro forma, and we negotiate on what we feel comfortable with. I then present the recommended operating budget. I started last night. The Finance Committee of the Council has its public hearing February 18th. The Council sets the budget cap February 23rd. The BET meetings with each department run through the first 3 weeks of March. They then have a public hearing on March 24th. The BET forwards a tentative budget to the Common Council. Your good selves set the final cap no later than April 13th. It could be 7 to 10 days earlier than that. And the BET sets the final budget and tax levy May 3rd. So it's lengthy, gives everyone an opportunity for input and hopefully excellent decisions. So the law of economics, as they apply to budgeting, I've discussed this last year. Economics is about making choices and trade-offs. It's about setting priorities and making decisions, knowing there are not enough resources to obtain everything we wish. There are many good requests, both on the operating and capital budget sides. We can't satisfy everyone at the same time, at the same amounts. We have to make trade-offs and set priorities. The law of diminishing return says, as we increase our spending or investment, for each additional expenditure on something, the amount of benefit we get becomes smaller and smaller. For example, if you're looking at an athletic skill or learning a language, the first 20 hours gets you so much benefit. Maybe you're at 50%. The next 20 hours gets you to 70%. The next 20 hours gets you to 80%. So as you increase for the same amount of investment, you get a smaller return. What we're trying to do as we allocate our budgets is we're trying to get the best return on investment. And sometimes when we invest too much in one area for too long, the returns start to diminish. And it might make more sense to shift the investment to another area where we would get a better return. Here is the budget, the recommended operating budget. Let me walk you through how it's structured. We have history here to give you context of 8 years. The total Norwalk expenditures have gone up from 327 million in fiscal year 15 to 400 million in the fiscal year 22 recommended budget. So for those 8 years, the growth, the ratio of 400 million to 327 is a total increase of 22.5% over those 7 years. The compound annual growth rate is 2.9%. What that means is if we took the 327 and increased it by 2.9% for fiscal year 16, then took that total and increased that total by 2.9% each and every year, that's called compounding because we get growth on the first year's growth. And all of that compounding would lead to 400.6 million. So the 22.5% total growth is equivalent to 2.9% on an annual growth rate basis. Then the top part of the chart is the city expenditures. The bottom is the Board of Education. So the city expenditures, the portion of the 327 was 160 million. The portion of the 400 million was 188. That growth, the total is, the average is 166. The total growth was 17%, and the compound annual growth rate was 2.3%. However, and you can see the annual increases or decreases. Let me point out in the yellow, 2 of those 8 years were declines. In fiscal year 16, our total expenditures on the city went down from 160 to 156, slightly up to 161, and then went down again to 159. There is an issue with those numbers being a little bit misleading because included in the city budget are expenditures on behalf of the Board of Education. Those expenditures are split into 2 parts. One is called in-kind expenditures. And the in-kind expenditures include everything from pension, workers' compensation, OPEB contributions, planning and zoning, legal department, accounting, payroll. So within all of our departments, public works, we are spending some of our money on behalf of the Board of Ed. It's really inappropriate to include that on the city side. These are numbers that are calculated each year by the controller, and every city does the same. And these numbers are then submitted to the State Board of Education. So there's no dispute over them. They were 10.3 million in fiscal year 15, an estimated 13.8 million in fiscal year 22. The second issue is that we in finance borrow the money on behalf of the entire city, including the Board of Education schools. So the cost of that borrowing translates into debt service, where each year we make payments of interest and principal repayment, and that's our debt service payment. So what we felt was appropriate was deducting the amount of our debt service that's appropriate and is on behalf of the Board of Education debt. And as with our debt, the debt has been increasing significantly. So the debt service has risen from 14.4 million in fiscal year 15, rising to an estimated 15.1 million next year in fiscal year 2022. So in essence, just about $29 million of our 188 million is on behalf of the city. On behalf, yes, 28.9 out of our 188 is on behalf of the Board of Education, excuse me. So the city net expenditures, deducting the in-kind and the debt service, we're going from 135.8 to 159.1. Similarly, the 7-year growth was 17.2% and 2.3% annually. For the Board of Education, the numbers are 166.4 to 212.6, which is our expectation of going from our current year $208.4 million with a $4.2 million increase, 2%, to 212.6 million in fiscal year 22. There were no down years. The 7-year growth was 27.7%, 10% more than the city, and the average annual growth rate was 3.6%. We're at 2.3. And you can understand with compounding, a small 1.3% change in compounding leads to a 10% difference in 7 years. So that is the Board of Education, what I'll call the nominal amount of money, portion of local taxes. However, just as we deducted the Board of Education in-kind and debt service expenses from our side, we must add them to the schools to show what their total expenditures of local taxes are for their benefit. So just as we had 24.7 here, we must add 24.7 to the school side. So their spending power from local taxes is 191.2 million. And that grew progressively to 241.5 million this coming year. The 7-year growth rate highlight the split of how taxpayers' local taxes is being used. So the traditional numbers would indicate that the city is spending, that the schools were spending 53 to 54%, and the city 46 to 47. However, after you make those adjustments, what's really happening is the schools are using 60 to 61% of the local taxes, and the city operations is being supported by 38 to 39%, 40%. Now, we recommend a public school increase of 4.2 million, 2% of their budget last year, the current year, fiscal year 22. It was approved last year, at the end of the budget cycle of 208.4 million. So the recommended amount of budget is $212.6 million. The adjusted amount, as I mentioned before, is in fact $241.5 million. I'd like to talk a little bit about the challenges that the mayor, your good selves on the council, and the Board of Estimate and Taxation have when establishing budgets for the public schools. Structural. Connecticut state law prohibits a city government like us from reducing a school budget below the prior year total. It only goes up, never goes down. I've worked in many private corporations and not-for-profits. I've never seen a restriction like that. It's very hard for fiscal restraint. Secondly, the mayor, the BET, and the council are only allowed to establish an upper limit, a ceiling on public school expenditures. The public school sets their own priorities and allocates resources only subject to the Board of Education approval. So on the city side, we give them the total line, here's the amount of money, but they're really not accountable to us in how they allocate that and what they spend it on. Consequently, last year, as part of the agreement to give them the record 5% increase or $9.9 million, it was agreed that we would enter into an efficiency study. Both the public schools and the city operations would be reviewed. We would retain efficiency experts to conduct these operations reviews, and there would be a commitment to implementing these recommendations to get the efficiencies and savings to benefit our taxpayers. And we had already conducted a joint cybersecurity review, which was very productive. Both sides were acknowledged to have done reasonably well on the cybersecurity, but of course, there are always recommendations. And to my knowledge, those recommendations have been implemented. So we'd like to see the same thing done on a public school and citywide operational review basis. So what happened was, after the budget was crafted in the summer, I want to give great credit to our Director of Purchasing and Procurement, Sharon Connors. She developed the RFP after extensive research on the internet, talking to other communities that had done these studies, and we crafted, it was a very complex RFP. There are probably 35 different departments when you think of both the city and the schools that have to be reviewed. And there are many differences, whether it's transportation, public works, law enforcement. So the consultants, you should recognize, have to spend a lot of time and effort developing a response to the RFP. But we worked very hard to publicize this and spread it far and wide. And we got 11 or 12 very thorough, rigorous responses in writing. There's a selection committee composed of representatives of both the city and the public schools, 6-person committee. And they did the heavy lifting, where they evaluated all of the 11 or 12 written responses, narrowed it down to 4 finalists. And because we can't do in-person meetings, we had Zoom meetings with each of the 4 finalist proposers. And we were just about ready to make a selection when it was determined that because Dr. Estrella was new and was not part of that agreement at the end of last year's budget cycle, that we took a pause to bring her up to speed. And I am hopeful that by the end of this month, in the next few weeks, we'll be able to select a firm and move forward on this efficiency study. And the reason we need the efficiency study, I'll give you an example on this next slide. I decided to select some data. Much of it came from our CAFR. We have historical data about the Board of Ed staffing, full-time equivalents, and it came either from the CAFR or from this year's presentation of the public schools operating budget. So from a staffing point of view, we're looking at full-time equivalent personnel. And what you'll notice is it went up in fiscal year 18 by 43 people, 19 in fiscal year 19. In fiscal year 20, the headcount went up by 181 people, from 1,228 to 1,409. Last year's budget, we went up by 111 people, from 1,409 to 1,520. And this year's requested budget has another increase of 39 people, going all the way up to 1,559. So what's happened is, between those 2 years, fiscal year 20 and fiscal year 21, the increase was almost 24% of the headcount was increased in 2 years, with another 39 coming in the next year. At the same time, I decided to look at enrollment. And what happened was, as you can see, they increased by 25, decreased by 53 in fiscal year 19. But in fiscal year 20, the headcount increased by 227, the enrollment. But this past year, fiscal year 21, the enrollment went down by 138. So for those 2 years, the enrollment only went up by 89, yet the headcount went up by 292 people. And next year, if you look at their projected enrollment, 11,808, compared to the actual enrollment for this year, they are projecting a headcount increase of 334, 50% larger than fiscal year 20, which was the largest increase in enrollment in any year. So one of the things I noticed is when I look at budget versus actual for their enrollment. Excuse me 1 second, I have to plug in. Thank you. So when I look at budget versus actual, their ability to predict enrollment, budget versus the prior year's actual, the budget was 195 higher than the actual enrollment. Okay, 11,608 versus an actual enrollment of 11,438. The next year they were over by 39. And the next year, even though the actual increase was 227, they were 147 over that. And last year, when it went down, they were 325 over from the actual. And this year, they're projecting 334. So what's happening is there's a tendency in their projections to be high on their enrollment numbers that come down with the actual. So here's your student enrollment actual versus budget. I'm sorry, that was the increase or decrease year by year. Here's the forecasting. There were 170 over the actual, 92 over the actual. And here, where there was an increase of 227 students, they were still 80 higher when they did their budget. And here, 463. Okay, so there's obviously a forecasting consistency here where their forecasts of enrollment are higher than when the actual actually come in. I also did one more thing. I did a ratio of students to FTEs, right? If you were trying to evaluate whether the FTEs are appropriate. So here, there was some consistency. There were 1,209 full-time employees, 11,438 students. The ratio of students to FTEs, about 9.5. The next year, it went down to about 9.3. The next year, it was 8.2. Fiscal year 21, 7.7. and forecast year 7.57, it's only that high because they're assuming a 334 student enrollment increase. If it wasn't for that, that might be as low as 7. So obviously, I don't understand these numbers. This is a first level review. But it would seem to me, maybe they're reasonable, but it would seem to me an expert consultant could come in, look at data far better than I could, and could get the explanations from the public schools to see whether these are reasonable numbers or not. So it's just an example of why an outside independent expert coming in to review the schools would help us a great deal in understanding their budget, their actual numbers, their operating statistics, and whether there are rooms for efficiency. Are there any questions? Okay,
Henry, it's Barbara. I have one question.
yes.
Just in terms of the enrollment for this current school year, is there an explanation as to whether or not the students actually were not enrolled, the numbers dropped, or are these students that are disengaged because of the COVID situation?
Barbara, I could just tell you, I took these numbers from statistics that were in the Board of Education operating budget book that was published this year. And so I took the numbers. I don't have any explanations.
Okay.
So I don't know, and I don't pretend to have asked the question and even gotten a response.
Okay, thanks.
Sure. Okay, so let me move on to the operating budget expenditures, and I can go into detail department by department. So here we have the Board of Ed, as I said before, 208.4 million. Our recommendation is 212.6 million, increase of 4.2 million, 2%. Let me start by looking and highlighting the contingency line item, which went down by 1.3 million from last year. Last year, if you recall, was a year in which we were negotiating a new contract and agreement with the unions. And we didn't want to tip our hand. So when we published the budget, it has increases that we expected because we had to publish the budget before we concluded the negotiations. So what we did was we took all of the raises and the step increases and we put them into this $2.8 million budget item in contingency last year. And we did that to hide what we were doing until after the conclusion of the negotiations. So this year, as with most years, we put all the salaries and increases into the raises, contractual raises, and the step increases into each department's budget for wages. So what's happening is contingency was inflated last year. So it's showing a decrease of 1.3 million. When we look at individual departments, their salary budget line last year was understated. It didn't have last year's increases. So when we look at some of the differences in the departments for salaries, it's really showing 2 years of increases. 1 year is partly because of this 1.3 million reduction in contingency. So for example, the budget, the negotiated wage increases was 2.35%, but you might see 4.7% in some departments because last year's raise was hidden in contingency. Good example is the Office of the Chief of Staff. They went up by 5%. Well, 4.7% of that might simply be the raises and step increases related to 2 years' worth. So contingency and the compensation line within each department are related. Okay. Community service, that has to be evaluated in conjunction with the grants line down here. Grants were 1.4 million and they were reduced by 500,000, 38%. That's because those grants were moved under Lamont Daniels' direction in community service. So if you look at his increase of 623,000, 500,000 of that is coming from an increase in grants. So when you look at the two together, obviously that's a very reasonable increase. Corporation Council, 182,000 isn't as large, but there's a 15% increase. So what's happening with the Corporation Council is that there are two line items in their budget that is increasing. One is called Other Professional Services. And that's where they retain professional assessors to assess properties when they defend and fight tax appeals. So they have to hire assessors. And as you're aware, because of the revaluation in 2018, we've had a tremendous number of tax appeals. And that's why we have a big increase in other professional services. Additionally, they increased their budget for outside counsel. This is for anticipated lawsuits for both the city and the Board of Ed. It may not occur, they may not need all of it, but they wanted to budget it to be prepared. The reason we have outside counsel is usually for two reasons. One would be a conflict of interest. An example might be if a police officer is brought up for misconduct. So internally, the police department, the city, is reviewing that individual's performance and looking at possible discipline. On the other hand, if the individual's performance is subject to a lawsuit against the city, the legal department would have to be defending that same officer. So to avoid that conflict of interest, we would use outside counsel. Secondly, we sometimes get litigation in areas that are very specialized where we just don't have that expertise on staff. A good example would be a class action lawsuit. Or recently, we had a situation where it involved the Fair Labor Standards Act, and we needed outside counsel who had expertise in that area of law. So that should explain the increase in the Corporation Council. Debt service, 32.4 million going up to 36.9, 4.5 million, 14%. I'm pleased to report that when I borrow money these days, I'm getting it at about bargain basement rates. However, because of our capital budgets and the tremendous amount of investment we as a city have decided to make over the last 4 or 5 years, we keep increasing our absolute debt level. And that just translates into debt service, as I said earlier. Debt service is what links the capital budgets to the operating budgets, and that's how it has to get paid. And therefore, it translates ultimately into the mill rate and the local taxes. So that will keep going up as we try to wrestle with our capital budget and projects. $1 million employee benefits. Included in that $1 million is our health insurance. And I'm pleased to say, although you might have heard from the Board of Education where they forecast a 13% increase in their budget, $6 million out of their $11.7 million request was because health insurance was going up. I got word, actually Tom Hamilton and I both got word because we're on the same policy with the same consultant, that this year's increase or next year's increase, in fact, will be 4%. So if you don't have to spend 13% and the increase is 3%, that would mean 2/3 of the $6 million increase is not necessary. That's a $4 million save on the public school side. We budgeted more conservatively than the schools because we went through this last year, and also we recognized that we thought the estimates were high. So we estimated 10%. And if we're going to come in at 4 to 5%, we're probably going to save in the neighborhood of $750,000 there. So that's some good news that we heard. And that's no fault of anyone. The Board of Ed has to submit their operating budget before we're able to get the best numbers for the health insurance. Moving down, I would look at the pension plans, 2.2 million, 16.6% increase. Last year with COVID, with the market falling out of bed in a very quick 6-week period, caused great concern. There are many assumptions which go into our required contributions for pensions and OPEB, post-retirement health insurance. One of them is what is the expected return on our investments? We have an excellent pension board. We have great pension consultants, and they work together to invest our portfolios as professionally as I've seen anyone. And they work very hard to get those returns. But there are times when the market returns less than what we expect, or sometimes even goes negative. Fortunately, for this past year, the market bounced back, so the reduction was much less than we might have seen. What's happening here specifically is that we had an early retirement incentive package, and 44 individuals selected that and are retired early based on the incentives. So from a pension point of view, there's a double whammy. The first is that the actuaries make assumptions about when all of the participants, the active participants in a plan, are going to retire. If they retire early, then we are going to have fewer years of them working and contributing assets into the trust to be invested. So we have fewer assets to work with. At the same time, one of the incentives was that there would be no penalty for them to start drawing their pension earlier than under normal rules. So here again, there are assets leaving the trust earlier than we expected. So that double whammy increases the required investment in the pension plans. It's not the whole amount, but it's a major reason why it's 17% this year. Now, I should mention that the offset to that is that a committee of the head of human resources, the mayor's chief of staff, and I went through every job title and position where someone was taking early retirement. And we also examined every vacancy in the city. And we had the following discussion. Do we need to replace this individual? Can those duties be reassigned to other people? That would save a whole salary and benefits. If we need to bring someone in, can we hold off for 6 or 12 months? That would give us some relief on the salary and benefits. And when we bring someone in, this happens more on the early retirement case. These are individuals who've had many years of experience, so their salary is at the higher end of the range and they're at the highest step. Can we bring in individuals who are earlier in their career who would start with a lower salary and a lower step? So we get savings that way. I'm pleased to announce that the savings we made on the early retirement and review of vacancies, despite the increase in the pension contributions, we saved over $500,000. Okay, so you're only seeing the pension contribution. You're not seeing some of the saves that are buried in each department in their salaries. Last, let me talk about Public Works, 1.8 million, 9.6%. So just as I indicated before with the contingency, when it came to salary raises, instead of the 2.35%, and when you add in, that's the contractual raise, but you also have step increases. So that might be 2.5% in total. Because last year's salary number was understated. It was buried in the contingency 2.8 million. That might be 5% out of the 9.6% increase in public works. The other reasons for the increase in public works are fixed contracts. So we work very hard with RFPs to negotiate for the best vendors with the best prices. But often those contracts include annual increases. So we have contracts with city carting for several different services: curbside garbage collection, citywide recycling collection, transfer station operations, and hauling fees, the tipping fees, which went up from $93 a ton to $95 a ton. So that's where the contracts with city carting. We also had contract with Guardian Services for building services. So there are numerous fixed contracts that, based on the RFP and the agreements we've signed, we are going to have increases that are not adjustable by us until we do another RFP. So that would explain why Public Works went up 9.6%, 1.8 million. Are there any questions?
Henry, I got a quick question, Mayor. We keep hearing that what's driving the Board of Ed budget increase is insurance. And I've had people on the city side, our experts, say that more likely scenario that it's going to come in around 8%, not the 13% being estimated. Henry, do we have a dollar amount for that difference, just to kind of put it in perspective,
I will
between
tell
the
you,
8% and the
I will tell
13%?
you, I got the email. I believe the email, we got a heads up yesterday, but we got a definitive email today. And if you recall, it wasn't just the 8% increase. What happened was the consultants estimated that the health insurance costs would go up 8%, and they used a broad national average as a proxy because they didn't have anything else. They then said that we have a regional adjustment. If you recall, when we went to Connecticut 2.0 plan, it was rated based on statewide data. Every city in the state got the same rate, but it's obvious that the costs of healthcare, doctors, hospitals, are much higher in Fairfield County. So in effect, we were subsidized by the other cities that were on the Connecticut 2.0 health plan. And over 2-year period, this current year and next year, there are adjustments being made to level the field for regionalization. So we were told with the estimate that there would be 8% for health insurance costs and 3.5% as sort of a penalty for the regionalization. And this would be the last year for that regionalization penalty. Tom took that 11.5% on the Board of Ed side and said it was a 13% increase for him because there was a change and he wouldn't be able to draw down money from his insurance fund. We took the estimate at 10%, and we were told today definitively, except for a very small subset, which are retirees who are not yet eligible for Medicare at age 65, and that rate increase is higher. But everyone else, it's a 4% increase, and it includes the regionalization penalty. So I took Tom's 13.5%, and I said, if we're at 4, that's about 1/3 of what he estimated. And I didn't use precise numbers. I thought it was 6 million or a little bit higher than that. So I'm assuming that his health insurance cost is really going to be 2%. And he saved $4 million with this notice from the consultant. On our side, I consulted our budget director, and based on our projected increase, we will save about $750,000.
Okay, we won't have confirmation of these numbers after the budget cap has been set in March or April?
No, I think Tom can tell you definitively how much the insurance cost would be and how much he's really going to have as an increase. And I could do the same. I could nail that for you before you set the cap. Yes.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Any other questions? Okay, thank you. Let's talk about unrestricted, unassigned fund balance, often mentioned as the rainy day fund. I start this chart with total expenditures of the general fund. The numbers are coming out of our CAFR, which contains our audited financial statements. 360.8, 339.4, 364.6 is our current year. No, is last, the fiscal year 20, where we have the audited financials. The current year budget, 385.6 million, and the recommended budget of 400.6 million. The unrestricted unassigned fund balance at the end of the year, according to our financial statements, was 56.7 million, which represented 16% of the total expenses, and 69.7 million, which represented 20.5% of the expenses. Now, the footnote I will explain. This year, after we issued an RFP, our longtime auditor, RSM, they had audited us for at least 2 contracts of 10 years, and they may have had even more extensive experience, said they withdrew their proposal for the RFP and said they were no longer auditing government clients. And I've heard that that's been happening across the state. And they said because we were already in the middle of an RFP, they felt terminating the relationship with us would be easiest because we were ready to hire someone else. And we ended up selecting Bloom Shapiro, the largest independent accounting firm in Connecticut and in New England. So when they went through our books, they said there's a government accounting standards board rule that says when a legislature, a council, approves a budget, and in that budget is a planned drawdown of the unrestricted unassigned fund balance as part of the budget, then we are required to move that money out of unassigned into the assigned category. And that's what they did in this year's audit. So 57.7, 69.7, those are the numbers you will see in our audited financials. The 66.4 is the equivalent calculation if we didn't take out the $6 million that we had planned to use this year, okay? So therefore, they said, actually it's the 8 million that we're using this year. So if we did it on an equivalent basis, our unrestricted, unassigned balance at the end of June 30, 2020 would have been 66.4 million. But because we have planned in this current fiscal year 2021 budget to draw down $8 million, you will see, if you look at our certified financials, that the unrestricted unassigned fund balance is 58.4, and there's an $8 million number in a category called assigned fund balance. It's all part of our fund balance, but it's just not unrestricted, unassigned. So what I tried to do here is recast our numbers on the assumption, I did them both ways. So historically, if that was 66.4, and at the end of our current year, where we planned on using $6 million drawdown, we would have 58.4, okay? The 58.4 is, no, the 66 is the only one I put on the former basis. So we have in our CAFR 58.4, but on the formerly calculated method, it's 66.4. So under the old method, we went from 16% to 20.5% to 18.2. However, in fiscal year 18, we already set the 19 budget where we plan to draw down 6 million. So the end of year balance would have been 51.7, only 14.3%. At the end of fiscal year 19, when we plan to use 6 million, the 69.7 would have been 63.7, 18.8%. So those ratios are really lower. And this year in our financials, we show 58.4 million, which is 16% of the actual expenditures for the year. Going forward, the next year, when we look at the planned drawdown, we start the year with the 58.4, we reduce it by 8, and we would get to 50.4 million this year. That's a projection on the assumption we use the entire $8 million drawdown. We'd be down to 13%. And this coming year, in the recommended budget, we're also recommending a drawdown of $8 million. That would take us, if everybody came in, the revenue came in on budget, the expenditures came in on budget, and we drew down the entire 8 million, we would be at 42.4 million, 10.6%. Now, what's very important to emphasize is that we have an excellent history of, even though we plan to spend our reserves, we don't. So in fiscal year 19, we planned on drawing down 6 million. Not only didn't we need to draw it down, we had a $6 million surplus. And that is why the reserves went up from 57 to 69. Instead of going down by 6, they went up, and it was a swing of 12 million. And that's how we got to the 69.7 million. Similarly, this past year, we expected to draw down 6 million. Expenses exceeded revenues by about $850,000. It's almost dollar for dollar the amount of COVID expenses we had. So management, the head of every department, did a great job, and our revenues basically equaled expenditures. We didn't have to draw down the 6 million, but we tapped into 750, 850,000 because of COVID. So we had 5.1 million left that we didn't draw down, but we planned to. The Board of Ed requested, and they are now allowed to request up to 2% if they run a surplus, and you granted it to them. So we gave them $4 million out of that surplus voluntarily. We didn't have to. We could have left it in reserves. But we put it into a non-expiring account. So if they don't spend that whole 4 million in fiscal year 21 that we're in now, they can continue spending it in fiscal year 22. They don't lose that money. So they got 4 million, and we gave 1 million in rollovers to certain city departments who said, look, I had a contract, I was going to spend money, but because of COVID, it got delayed into fiscal year 21. We gave them the million as an inducement for being good managers, and also to just reflect the reality that they needed it to spend in 21. So we voluntarily took down almost the entire 6 million, but it wasn't out of desperation where other governments have revenue shortfalls or they have expenditures that are exceeding the budget. We came in, we managed well, and we controlled it and decided to give the 6 million because we were at 18.2%. This year's 8 million, I am hoping similarly that we will not have to draw down the entire 8 million, that we can manage that. President Biden is talking about a $1.9 trillion aid package, which would include tens of millions for the Board of Ed and millions for us. And so we're hoping that that kind of benefit package and COVID reimbursements might come in that would allow us to not have to draw down the 8 million this year. The reason we put in 8 million for this year and 8 million for next year is a very simple one: COVID. We know that our citizens, our taxpayers are under financial pressure. There are people who've lost jobs, people who have been furloughed, businesses which have gone out of business, businesses that have been locked down. The economy is suffering, and now we're in our second wave of COVID. So last year, if you recall, we had our final budget sessions in April after COVID hit, and we tried to accommodate the taxpayers and said, we will draw down $8 million because we want to give them relief on the mill rate and tax bill increases.
Henry, excuse me, one moment. It's now 7:30, so if you could kind of go through the next slides and start wrapping up so we can get into the regular meeting of the Common Council.
Absolutely. Thank you.
You.
So that was the reason that we took the $8 million. We're trying to minimize the effect on the citizens. Proper uses of fund balance, it's usually one-time disasters, economic loss of an employer, physical, a hurricane, school burning down, medical, COVID, or we use it to pay down long-term liabilities. If we develop large balances in the future, we should use them to pay off pension and OPEB liabilities. I'm pleased to say we are 75% funded in each of those, which is very good. The state of Connecticut is less than 50% on their pension. So I'm pleased with where we are on these liabilities, but that would be a proper use down the road. Last slide. How does all of this translate into tax levy and mill rates? Here are the expenditures. The current year, 208, 177, total 385. Board of Ed 212, City 188, the recommended 400.6 for next year. Last year's approved budget by district, the mill rate, 2396 for first, second, and third, 2404 for the Seward fourth, 2361 for the fifth with garbage, and 22.25 for the sixth. This year's recommendation, the mill rate will go from 2396 to 2498, first, second, and third, from 2404 to 25004 in the fourth, from 2361 to 24556 in the fifth, and from 2225 to 23.044 in the sixth. Tax bills. Based on the direction of the city assessor, we're using the same median home values by district of 2019. The approved budget, the tax bill by district, 5762, 5454, 7303, 6646, 88, 76, 16,963. The recommended, the translation of these mill rates into tax bills, 5985, 5667, 7596, 6890, 9229, 17623. The amount of increase of the tax bills by district, 223, 213, 293, 244, 353, 660. On a percentage basis from the current year's tax bills, 3.86% in the first, 3.9% second, 4.01 third, 3.67 in the fourth, which we often use as a benchmark, the average, 3.98 in the fifth, 3.89 in the sixth. That's the translation. Summary, it's a very tough budget year. We have COVID, we have constraints, but we feel this is balanced, fair, with fiscal restraint and affordable for all single-family owners. I'll take any last questions.
Henry, are we going to get a copy of this deck?
Sure, if you wish, I'd be happy to distribute that.
Thank you. That would be
Henry,
great.
you can email that out tonight if you would to all the council members. And I know we're going to be getting the budget books very, very soon. I want to thank Henry and I want to thank Angela for their hard work. This is a very, very difficult budget year. And I know we are looking at some of our residents who have lost jobs. There are businesses that are not making a profit. They're losing money. So we have to be very, very fiscally responsible because that's what we were elected to do. And so as we move forward, the council members will be setting the cap on the budget. And then the BET will work to come in at that cap so that we don't have to come back and ask for an increase. But it's going to be tough. And I'm going to tell all the department heads that when they come before the Board of Estimate and Taxation, they can't be looking at any increases of over and above what Mr. Dakowitz has put forward, unless there's a critical emergency that they better be prepared to respond to. So I know that it's 7:36. Any last questions for Mr. Dakowitz?
Thank you very much.
Please feel free to call my office, call Mr. Dakowitz at any time after you look at the budget if you have any questions that you would like answered. So if there's no further questions, I'll entertain a motion to adjourn. Ms. Revolute.